What's up, Derek?
Hey, I'm well.
Hey, man. It's good to see you. I mean, it's been since maybe October since we got to hang out.
Yes.
Well, it's nice. It's really nice to have you over. And so we're doing our end of the year 2018 podcast.
It's the end of 2018, everybody.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of reflect on this podcast and its 1 year history.
Yeah, so it's been about a year. Do you remember? I think we released the first episode the end of December, right?
Or it was early January. I talked about it in the last the episode with Katie, my little intro.
I listened to it.
I'm forgetting the specific date. I think it was like January 9th, I want to say. Something like that.
Sounds like a good date.
But I think we recorded the first episodes in December. Mm-hmm. But it took us 2 or 3 recordings to get that first episode done.
Yeah,
Do you remember that?
Yeah, because we also talked to Marcus the same day, I think. He came over in a Santa hat, and we talked, and then he peaced out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So December is technically the birth of the podcast. Mm-hmm. And then I believe the first episode came out very, very early January. So yeah, I mean, we did the first year of a podcast. I mean...
Woo, go us.
I know.
That was pretty good.
I'm proud of us too, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
we released every other week on a Monday, just like we promised. You're welcome, world.
We were not that organized. But hey, sometimes we did episodes every week sometimes. Yeah. And then we would go a month without releasing one, you know? So yeah, I mean...
We did a writing group in April. Do you remember that?
That's true.
That was cool.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that again.
We did
Unless we get someone else to do it. I feel like if you're interested in helping curate an online writing group, hit us up. I feel like we need more people to do that if we're going to do it again.
Yeah, that was a lot of work. But yeah, so I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about just this past year of doing the podcast. We of course miss Lauren very terribly.
Yes, she is back in South Carolina. Hey, Lauren.
What's up, Lauren?
How do you feel about how the podcast has been going so far, and how do you feel like it's changed since last year?
Well, I did a little thinking about that due to the fact that I just talked with Katie, you know, because I went on her show probably about over 2 years ago, and that was my first time being on a podcast. I had been listening to podcasts for a while. I was always sort of interested in the format, but that was kind of my first experience actually being on one. And I remember that day thinking it would be really cool to do a podcast. And you know, I remember having those initial meetings with you and Lauren, trying to figure out, I mean, if you actually remember, I think we were originally thinking about doing it more under the Unspoken Word brand and kind of just talking about Charleston poetry. It would almost be this document of the Charleston poetry scene. And I think it was actually maybe your idea to kind of do it more under Contribute Your Verse, which would kind of open it up to talking to a lot of different kinds of writers and just expand the field of conversation, which I think has worked pretty well. I think if we had done just an Unspoken Word podcast, we might have run out of steam. Maybe. I don't know.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I have loved doing this podcast. I mean...
I like the name, too. Really. I think it was the name. Where I was like, can we just call it Contribute Your Verse? That's such a good name. And I think we had some other names, but they were all dumb. I don't remember exactly what they were, but it was like a Keep It Lit, I think was my favorite. Keep It Lit, or like The Book Corner, or something like that. Or
Keep It Lit was going to be your what do broadcasters do at the end?
A tagline.
The tagline, like the sign-off tagline.
Yeah. Keep it lit, y'all.
No, I have immensely enjoyed doing this podcast, and we were talking before we started recording about just kind of growing in our ability to interview and have natural sounding conversations, as opposed to really awkward, fake sounding conversations, which is...
I concur.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, now back to our sponsors.
Yes. So totally natural. Yeah. But no, I've really I don't know, just the last few interviews that we were just talking about, like, you know, Marlanda, who's a guest not too long ago. I've just really been loving, just going really deep with you know, one of the things I said with Marlanda was that, like, I consider her a really, really good friend, but she's someone that I don't actually get to see that often. There's so many people we know in kind of the Southeast literary community that are friends. We respect their work. Like, we've grown as a result of their writing, but how often do we really get to sit down with them and actually, like, talk uninterrupted for an hour? That's actually, like, a pretty precious, really cool thing. And that's probably what I've loved, is just that opportunity to have, you know, really, really just cool conversations with people that you don't get to have if you just bump into them at an open mic and you catch up for 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. You know?
You get to ask questions that would otherwise be not socially appropriate. So
right.
When you wrote this poem and you said this, you know, you can ask them, you know, about their writing life and all those things, which I think is cool, because I think I wonder about that stuff anyways, and it kind of gives you an excuse to have that conversation of like, hey, I really want to know what this person's process is. Right. Well, if I bring them onto a podcast, I could ask, you know.
Versus if you corner them at the coffee shop.
Bar,
yeah, that's...
So...
Yeah. What were you thinking about when you wrote this poem?
Yeah, which is funny, because I think that we originally built this podcast as, it's just like a conversation at the bar after the poetry reading.
Oh, that is true.
With a microphone.
Yeah.
But there is a difference, for sure.
So yeah, what's this year been like for you in terms of a podcast host, and how have you grown, and what have you learned?
Well, one big thing that I think we've had to adjust to is learning how to interview, which means learning how to listen, because I have my own opinions about things, and sometimes if you ask a question, I'll be like, oh, I have an answer to that, but you're the one asking the question. Does that make sense?
Right.
So I think that could be quite interesting to just sit and listen without interrupting, which sounds like that's such a jerk thing to say, but I think
that's just being a decent human being, like listening
to
people. No, it is more complicated when you get into these more intellectual things, you know.
Yeah, for sure, and it can be really cool to have that and to be able to listen to someone else talk about a subject and reflect upon that.
Yeah. I don't maybe mean to put you too much on a spot, but do you remember maybe a particular guest or a certain conversation where you felt like, I don't know, maybe something they said you felt like you really grew a lot from, or sorry, I probably should have prompted you beforehand. I'm just curious if anything
I was really interested. So a couple of our guests I thought were really, really great. Jonathan Brown.
I was thinking about some things he said too.
Yeah, one thing too was this idea of basically being 100% at what you do, which is absolutely not how I operate. I wear a million different hats. You know, I help run a nonprofit. I teach creative writing. I have a full-time job as a historic curator. I'm a poet. I'm a novelist. I also sell, you know, I act as my own agent and all these different things. So, you know, I basically can't, it's impossible to be 100% anything. Yeah. But I think he really devotes 100% of his energy to what he is doing at any one time. Yeah. Which also I think is important, because that creates 100% presence, which I think is really nice. I definitely have a problem of if I have to do something later that day, I'm already working through how I'm going to do that, or how I'm going to write a scene, or how I'm going to introduce a poem instead of necessarily listening to the poem that came before me at some reading or whatever. Yeah. And I think it's cool to... he was talking specifically about being a teacher, about not bringing, kind of your own work. That's been something really interesting this year. I became a creative writing teacher.
Yeah. You're working with mostly third graders, elementary school students,
third and fourth graders, and one second grader. But what's really funny about that is that they don't care what awards you've won or what you've published. They really care about whether you brought stickers and whether you are a good listener, and whether so the sort of ability for us to kind of talk with kids, I think is quite funny because it kind of definitely completely made me rethink how I would approach teaching adults as well. Because you kind of walk in with a resume a bit. Like, I definitely do. I try to be like, oh, well, I've done this and this. I think that's a little bit of overcompensating for being the young person in the room all the time. I'm kind of starting to not be that. I'm still young, but I'm not like a 19-year-old anymore.
Right.
So it's cool to be able to walk into a room and, first of all, I'm Mr. Berry because they're 10. So, of course, but also...
You've officially graduated to
I
Mr.
have
Berry.
to come in and teach them. I can't rely on just being the poet guy. Or I can't entertain them. I've never read them a poem of mine or performed for them because they truly do not care about what I do. They just care about their stories, which is great. That's what I'm there for.
Yeah, Jonathan said a number of things in that podcast. I remember him talking about... like sending handwritten thank you notes to venues and just like really practicing a lot of gratitude for people, just on your artistic journey. Just again, if someone invites you to do a reading or whatever it might be, like taking that time to thank them really personally. Like I remember another cool thing from this year, we did a cool writers conference through the South Carolina Writers Association. And, and Bryn McLean, who was a part of that conference that day, we interviewed her. I got a wonderful handwritten thank you note from her, after a week or two later. And it's like, it reminded me of that thing Jonathan said. Like that goes such a long way. Like I have infinite love for Bryn, I already did, but that handwritten note just sealed the deal. And it just makes me realize, God, I don't do enough of that.
I need to do more of that. I remember...
I don't even text people thank you enough, let alone a handwritten thank you card.
Yeah, I got a letter after that from Polly Buxton. From Bucks and Books. Yeah. And it was like, hey, we really enjoyed having you. We look forward. We hope, if you do a book release or do something, that you'll come to us. And I mean, it's made me very much be like, as soon as I do another book tour, this is, a place I'm going to hit up. Yeah. Because it's really amazing.
It's that relationships thing. And I know that's something that, going back to our first guest, I know Marcus talks about that all the time. So much of his continued success, in Charleston has so much to do with cultivating relationships with venues, relationships with other artists, even politicians, having a good relationship with the mayor. That's a nice thing to have in your back pocket.
Handy when you need to apply for grants.
Maybe get out of jail.
Yes, precisely. I've noticed that too. I mean, most of my writing this year was, I think, the first year that I really tried to be, I guess, quote unquote, successful to strangers, as weird as that sounds. But I think most of the success I've had and the growth I've had is because of relationships. I took some classes in college, but I've never really, studied poetry or studied fiction in a really sustained way. But I have through relationships of just saying one of our guests, for example, Len Lawson, I feel like, I knew him and he kind of knew who I was, but I feel like more and more, it's quite cool to be like, oh yeah, this is a sort of mentor or a friend, and someone you can reach out to and talk to. And on top of that, that opens up a lot of opportunities. You and Marcus were also kind of the first mentors of Charleston for me, and kind of started opening doors to new things and being like, oh, well, you can, you can read poems, and you can read poems at this coffee shop, and then you can read poetry at the music hall, or, and then it kind of gets bigger and bigger. And I think that those opportunities do come from relationships. And I try to reflect that too. One thing I love about the unspoken word is the ability to now pay people to come read poetry. And one thing we're gonna try to do again in 2019 is bring in more local people and also pay them for their poetry. And just have this idea of hey, we like what you're doing. You should take yourself seriously. I think, getting paid $60 or $100 to read poems makes you start to rethink your whole career, It's totally hey, does. Yeah, I can do this. I can do this.
I mean, I think frequently about just being asked to do my first feature, like the old, Monday night poetry music. That wasn't even getting paid, but that was 45 minutes of me getting to feel like I have, everyone's full attention for 45 minutes. Like that was huge for me. I remember coming home, I couldn't even sleep because I just had so much energy running through my body because I just read poetry for 45 minutes. Yeah, I mean, it is really cool when you can create opportunities for other people. Like it gives you, I mean, I know you said just a moment ago, like, maybe I opened some doors maybe for you early on, but dude, I was just trying to open the door for myself too. And then like, come on, let's all sneak through, like it constantly keeps giving back. Like when you give to others, you end up, it's just karma, like,
yeah.
And, and I was just thinking actually at the end of November, like I went up to Greenville. I'm thinking about other guests, Glennis Redmond, who was in maybe episode 4 or 5, and Kimberly Sims, who was maybe 8 or 9 or something like that. I was up in the Greenville area. Glennis invited me to do a reading at the Peace Center, which went extraordinarily well. And then I kind of wanted just to like hang around for a little bit, maybe pop up to Asheville for the day. And Kimberly Sims had like an Airbnb spot. Let me stay at her place for free for 2 nights.
That's super cool.
Super cool, and that just came out of, and again, those are 2 people I see once or twice a year. But it's like it is that poetry family that does, and like most families, there's drama and conflict and whatnot, but there also can be some incredible generosity that can come through. And I don't know, it's, one of the early taglines for the show we settled upon was this, we wanted to include the word community in that. And I think that's like a theme that's run through this whole podcast is like just the importance of having writing friends.
Yeah.
Really, just as simple as that. Like if you're a writer and you don't have writing friends, you need to work on that, because like those are the people that are not just gonna like support you creatively, someone to read your rough drafts, but it's just little moments of generosity are gonna come your way by and not seeking out writing friends to like and like to get something from them, but to have that community. They're gonna give to you, you're gonna give to them, and so many good things will come from that.
Yeah, one really cool thing. So I have been living in Aiken, South Carolina for about 2 years, and really trying to build community there. And one, I've been going to the South Carolina Writers Association meetings. So like our last meeting, we had like a Christmas party. So we went out to get Chinese food and like all talked, and it was kind of like an open mic. Some people shared some stories or publication news or all sorts of stuff. So that was really cool. Yeah. And they've been super supportive. And I also, there's like a private poetry workshop that I think was started by a couple of like ex-college professors in the area, and I've been going to that, and it's just like really nice because like you get together and they're doing, like one dude just won this like book award. Some people have never published anything, and other people have published like 9 books, but like it's really cool to kind of see people talking about poetry and pushing each other and giving each other opportunities as well, which is quite cool. We talk about like, what submission, like at the beginning of each meeting, we talk about what submission opportunities are available, and we kind of talk about what we should all submit to. So that's cool.
Well, that's probably a good transition to talk about like our writing lives this past year. And I know you submitted a whole lot, got accepted a whole lot, won a few awards, and so just beyond that, like your process, your writing joys this year. What was 2018 as a year for you as a writer?
Yeah, so I'll start with the validation was really cool. So this year, 2017, I think that I was writing quite a lot, but also I think I had published in 2 journals. One was the zine and one was something else. But anyways, like I really wanted to kind of get, I think that I guess I wanted to be read more because I this year is also very complicated in many ways. So, if you go back to episode 1, you probably heard me talk about me having a book come out. And I probably talked about it a bunch of other times. That's not happening anymore because I've kind of somewhat broken ties with the publishing company that I was with. Just because of issues. It was taking a very, very long time to come out with that book, and eventually the decision was made, we're just not doing the book anymore. Which is, on one hand, extremely frustrating because I think having a book out through a publishing company feels like this big thing that you can have and say, hey, I'm a real writer. And I have that as like a novelist, but
and just for clarification for listeners, so you're talking, it was a poetry book that was planned.
So I had a poetry book.
And you have a novel that's published.
So I had a poetry book that was supposed to come out. We'd signed a contract and everything, but it's no longer coming out. But I think that I wanted to try to... Most poetry books that are published through like major publishers or small publishers have most of the poems in them already published. So one of my goals was to get some of those poems published before the book came out, which was supposed to be around the end of this year. So I sent out a bunch of my work. I remember it started with, it was a brand new magazine. I was in their issue 1 called Lemon Star magazine, that mostly published like millennials and college students. So that was really cool. They published 3 of my poems, and then like very soon after I published in a place called like Rabbit Oak. And then like within a month I had like 5 or 6 different poems accepted. So I was like, hey, I can really do this. So I kept submitting my work all year, and 2 poems came out via Glint Journal, but I think in total it was like 23 poems published this year in journals, which was pretty cool. That's a book. So that was really cool. So like what was nice about that was getting recognition from people. Like I know Sam Sachs was one of the editors, which is cool. Who I really, really love his poetry. And other people too. Like I've started to build communities. If you listen back, there was an episode where he talked about Barrett Warner, and he's a really cool guy. I haven't published in his lit mag just because I feel like that would be weird. One day maybe I'll submit, but he said that he worked with writers a lot to help them kind of improve, and editors aren't these, like, they're real people, and one really cool thing is like they'll work with you. I can't say it because it hasn't been accepted or declined yet, but a really, really like pretty awesome poetry magazine reached out to me about one of my poems and basically helped me make major revisions to the poem. And it ended up being so much better, and I was just like, even if they don't accept it, I still come out with a better poem at the end. So like building those relationships and people taking you seriously and being like, I think it's a little unfair in the academic world if it's like, I'm a poet. I think you should be able to say that without qualification. But sometimes people will say, oh, well, like, where have you published? And honestly, it feels good to be able to tell them places that they actually know the names of, which is cool. So this year, and awards too, which was cool. Like I was like the finalist for a lot of awards. So like I was a finalist for 2 different chapbook prizes, and then also Gigantic Sequence. Do you know Gigantic Sequence at all? No. They're a pretty a major literary magazine, and I was super psyched. So I was like a finalist in their poetry prize, and they're also going to publish the poem in their issue in the spring. And you know who else is a finalist? Len Lawson. Oh, nice. So I saw the PDF already, and our poems are right beside each other. So it's cool to be like, Len to me is like a real poet. You know what I mean? He's like won all these awards. He's about to come off his like 2nd book. So it's cool to be like, hey, we're side by side in the journal, in this like major literary journal. And then I won the poetry prize at South Carolina Poetry Society, which was cool. And that was like a really cool thing because I've gotten a lot more involved with the Poetry Society of South Carolina and just really loving the stuff that they do, and I hope to keep doing stuff with them.
You'll be doing a reading, I think maybe February?
March.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm opening up for Tiana Clark. Do you know her?
No.
You have to check out her work. It's amazing. Yeah, I got to. I felt bad. Danielle, who runs the reading series, was like, Who do you want to open for?" And I saw her name, and I was like, "Her," because she's amazing. Because also, like, everyone's going to be in that reading. So I was really psyched to be able to do that. I'm really excited for that. And then recently won the Kakalak Poetry Prize, which Kakalak is like Carolina. It's not only Carolina writers, but it's specifically for Carolina writers. So that was a nice check. I just used all that money to fix my car. And then I just won the last thing of the year was the Emery's Prize. And Emery's is out of Greenville. So that was really cool. And like, you know, talking about like community, it's like, I had friended this woman on Facebook, Claire Bateman, who's and like I didn't even know she was involved. And I was like, "Oh, that's who you are." And I think like we had met through Barrett Warner because she won all these different things. It's just cool to see like different stuff come to fruition, and it's cool that like people are reading my poetry and taking it seriously. It feels like I'm transitioning into more of a stable writer, if that makes any sense, of being like, I don't know, I feel like with the novel, you feel a lot like, oh, you got a novel published, or you're going to be like a one-hit wonder kind of, I don't know, not that was a wonder that much, but it's just cool to be able to have that validation. So that's kind of on the publishing side of things. On the writing side of things, I feel really good, so poetry-wise, I'll kind of talk about that first. I wrote a lot of poems this year. Most of the poems that were published this year were also written this year. I mean, I don't really have a writing practice with poetry, just because I kind of write poems every day. Like, I wrote a poem, so I carry around notebooks everywhere with me. I have these like little pocket notebooks, so they can slip in your pocket. I have little tiny pencils that I carry around, so that I can write down a poem literally wherever. And then I also, especially when I'm driving, carry around a voice recorder and record ideas for stories or poems. So on the way down here, I was driving along the interstate, and I saw these like billboards that I thought were very funny. So I'm gonna be writing a poem that's like a triptych called 3 Billboards Outside Bowen, South Carolina. But like, just ideas come all over the place. I've been writing, I have no idea how many poems, but I've probably written more than 100 poems this year, which is quite cool. Not all of them good, but I also, I love cannibalizing old poems and making new stuff out of them.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, congrats on like such a successful year. I mean,
and we're hoping, awesome. With this whole book, it was kind of a blessing in disguise. I hate when people say that, but I think that I could write a lot. It's it's gonna be my first. I have a chapbook out, but this is gonna be my first like real foray into the poetry world with a book. So I think it'll be good to have a better book. And it'll just net like, for sure. So it helped me, I have the book out right now at like 6 different contests. So look forward to some news. Hopefully, we'll see. Yeah. But I have pretty good hopes.
Well, I think, and I know the thing with your publisher has been going on for a while, and I know you haven't really felt able to talk about a lot of the details, but I think it is sort of instructive, and I think it's something for particularly younger writers to be aware of, that there's not necessarily like a golden ticket to writing success. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
You still need to make every decision like as carefully as possible, and maybe you get an offer to do X as a writer, and maybe that's not the best situation, and
but it's this year's been wild in other ways. Like we did the Food and Wine Festival earlier this year, and like my poems were made into murals, and that was just like, that could have made my year. Right. I did like a TED Talk that could, this year's kind of been insane. And I've gotten to speak on panels. I spoke at my first like university gig, which is cool. I spoke at University of South Carolina, Aiken. Just stuff like that, like really were amazing. So it's like, hey, this is, And I feel like that stuff starts to lead to other stuff. It kind of becomes a snowball. So even without that particular publishing deal, by the way, I am going to continue doing stuff with this. I have one last project with this publisher, which I'll tell you about in 20 minutes when we talk about 2019.
Cool. Yeah.
So, one thing I've noticed, I guess, about you, we talked about earlier, like you, well, first, you have published some things in 2018. You want to talk about those things first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm trying to.
You published some essays.
As we've,
and some poems.
It's just funny, thinking, as we've brought up so many things like events, like I forgot about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
This year was sort of a really rich but also kind of odd year for me as a writer. I wrote a lot this year. I probably just sheer word count. I probably wrote more than I ever have, but it was also a slightly more private year for me as a writer, where I wasn't somewhat intentionally, somewhat just circumstances. I definitely didn't submit as much or attempt to publish as much, just because I felt like I was really going through like a lot of just creative transitions. I would say this was like a big transition year, and 2019 will probably continue to be so, but that's all fine. I did have a few interesting poems get published this year. One that was personally very meaningful to me was the Fall Lines collection that Ray McManus ended up being the judge of, which I didn't even know when we submitted all those. And I know you had a poem. What was the poem you got?
Ecology for Queers.
Yeah. I remember Ed really likes that poem a lot. Yeah, Ed Madden. That was a really cool moment because Ray McManus, I might have mentioned this on the podcast before, but he was a poetry mentor of mine when I was in high school. When I was a high school student, I had an English teacher, Miss Thompson, who invited Ray to come do these workshops on Sundays at school. Like, I went up to my high school on a Sunday afternoon to like hang out with Ray McManus, and I thought he was the coolest motherfucker ever. And he is, and he was, and he will continue to be. And so yeah, he ended up being the judge of that poetry contest, and the submissions, and then there was a contest, and I think I was the finalist. Yeah, I was like one of 2 finalists.
Cool.
So
yeah,
that felt really good. That was my poem, Prayer for the Rebound, which I still think is probably just artistically one of my favorite poems from this year. I really liked some of the lines in that poem. That one was really cool. And actually, at the start of the year, I got a really funny poem published too. It was an erasure poem I did of "Oh Captain, My Captain." That was about Trump. And it's so funny. I remember when I did that poem, it took me about 10 minutes to do. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I bet some literary magazine is going to like freaking love this. Because it's clever in this kind of literary way, and I sent it off, and they like, it was it's called like Heart Mag or something like that.
Heart Journal.
Yeah, Heart Journal. It's kind of focused on political issues.
Art and social activism.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you for knowing that better than I do.
It's a pretty big journal.
Yeah. I think, did I maybe read they're shutting down though, or
I
some
know
kind of transition?
I think they're getting new editors.
Something like
maybe.
that.
I don't know.
Yeah. But that was also like a nice little moment of validation. Like, I know what was that dude, Cam Awkward Rich, right? Was one of the editors, and but I don't know. That poem kind of felt like it was odd for me because there's poems that you could spend weeks and months revising and trying to get perfect, and you feel like it's such an artistic statement of like you're writing a philosophy, and like nobody publishes that poem, and then a poem you spend 10 minutes on that's sort of a joke to you, like that gets picked. That was the only funny thing to me about that experience.
I certainly had experiences where like I write a poem and I'm like, you want this, don't you? Recently, there's a poem I wrote in like 2015, which I've probably done about the Icarus poem. That just got accepted to a literary journal, and I've been sending out the poem for like 3 years. I mean, like, please publish.
So
I was like, I want to publish this poem. I was like, it's so good.
Yeah.
So it finally got accepted.
Yeah.
I was like, yes.
But probably my most exciting publishing thing this year actually wasn't poetry.
Good Juju.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Did that happen? Was that last year or this year?
No, that happened this year, didn't it?
Jesus.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
it came out this year. It came out in March.
Oh, okay.
It was.
Yeah, so that was
it was
unspoken
compiled
word
last
production.
year.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I was the
gotcha.
editor.
Yeah. Thanks for
I
accepting my poems.
I almost didn't let you in, but it was okay.
That was.
Sorry.
Man, that's a real prize moment of mine. I had my first non-poem publication, maybe ever. I had an essay on masculinity that was published by Elephant Journal, which is a pretty big deal online publication. So it was right after in the midst of the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearing stuff. So there was obviously a lot of conversation going on about sexual assault and men and the Me Too movement. And so I wrote an essay reflecting on masculinity and kind of particularly taking a kind of Jungian psychology look at that, which has increasingly been an intellectual interest of mine. And it was really interesting to be somewhat out of my element, but I've always kind of written essays here and there, particularly about political issues. Like I remember right after the Charlottesville kind of white supremacist rally, I wrote an essay about kind of whiteness in the South. Like I've always had that voice, that more essay voice in me, but I never really did much with it. I would just maybe post it on Facebook, and then family and friends would like it. But it was really cool, and Elephant Journal actually initiated like a new payment system for essays. So my essay was like the 8th most popular essay that month. They paid me $100.
Oh,
Their number one read essay each month gets like $500. And they were really awesome to me. They were like, please keep sending us more stuff. So that's actually I know we're going to talk about 2019, but that's actually a big goal for me, is developing that essay voice, and particularly being able to talk about maybe kind of more spiritual, self-development, psychological themes as well. And talking about creativity, this whole like kind of writing coaching thing. I want to be able to present that more in essay form, and if Elephant Journal likes it, I'll keep sending them stuff. So that was a very cool experience for me. I mean, I remember I wrote that essay like in about 2 days, and they picked it up like immediately. And I mean, I'll admit, when it went live, I probably sat in front of my laptop the entire day, hitting refresh about every like 15 seconds, seeing how many people read it. But I think it got up to nearly about 3,000 views.
Nice.
Which felt pretty fucking good. So that was a big deal. But just in general for me, like poetry wise, like I said, I think this is very much kind of a transition year for me. Like I'm going to be moving in the upcoming year, and so that's feels very significant to me, both personally and artistically. Like Charleston has been the center of my personal life, but also my creative life I've been here for 16 years, dude.
Yeah, and you basically moved once in your life so far, right?
Right, yeah.
From
I mean, I went from
Columbia
Columbia to here. When I was in my mid-20s, I did a year of travel. Like, so I lived in Thailand for 6 months and that sort of thing. But yeah, Charleston has been my whole universe for a long time. And And I've also had an approach as a writer that's a very kind of grassroots approach. Like, and again, I think Marcus played a big role in that, because I think he's someone who kind of looks at, like, I want my poems to be able to speak to like the people right around me before I necessarily try to like get someone in California to like my work.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of just a more local centric approach to writing, and I think I kind of adopted that, and that served me really well for like a long time. But I kind of feel like my creative life in Charleston hit a little bit of a dead end this year, where I just didn't feel like Charleston was my muse anymore. you know. So that's been a little bit, you know, I really slowed down on how many events I was going out to, and so 2019 I feel like will be a year of kind of a rebirth, and you know, I'll be in a new city, and I'm really looking forward to that, because I just think I've just been here too long.
That makes
You
sense.
know?
How do you feel that you know, making that decision has changed your approach to writing, especially if you're going to be writing to a bigger audience, I guess?
Well, it's changed it in a few ways. I mean, like, you know, Charleston and Asheville have very different personalities. You know, like there's always been, you know, my Charleston writing life, I guess, has been a very, you know, kind of city-based writing, and a lot of political issues and social issues, and responding to things happening in the news, both locally. My move to Asheville kind of feels like, and I'm already feel like I'm moving towards this. Like for years, like when I go up to Asheville, it's just something about the mountains. It's usually just a more introspective energy for me. It's a more connected to nature. So really over the last year, I've been writing a lot more nature-centric poems, and more poems about spirituality, and you know, just more inward-looking. But you know, like Marlanda and I talked about this. You know, particularly having spent a lot of time in the slam world, you're kind of taught to, like, nature poems don't work in slams. Like, let's just be honest. You know what I mean? Like, a poem about a tree is not going to win a poetry slam. Right? And so I think for me, like, a lot of this transition has been kind of getting away from, like, you know, asking, like, is this poem going to work on button poetry? You know, because for probably the two of us, for a lot of years, like, that kind of trying to write a spoken word poem that's gonna like get a 30 and go viral was probably the apex of
Your
writing goal. Yes.
Yeah.
And for me, that has totally shifted for me now. But I've been a little lost because of that. You know, it's a good kind of lost. Like it's I'm trying to find my way. But yeah, getting on button poetry is no longer a goal. You know, like it's totally something different now, and I don't know exactly what that thing is. That's sort of the new goal, but it's different, and I'm going to be discovering that a lot in the new year. I feel like. Did that make sense?
That totally makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see. I've had a similar trajectory of like, oh, this year, yes, more people have read my poems, but also I've stopped writing so much for other people. Like I'm writing very, very personal poems that I'm like, I write kind of whatever I want to write, and they're very weird sometimes, but then it's like, that's kind of what people like. It's like, oh, they, you know, write, and also like that makes me more proud. Like, so there was at least one or two poems I got published this year that I definitely wrote in order to get published. Does that make sense? So there was one, and I remember I went to a reading for the journal, and a lot of people came up to me and were like, I love your poem, and it spoke to me, and I just sat there, and I'd gotten 2 poems published in this journal, and I read the one that was like the crowd pleaser, but I was like, man, I really like the other one more. And it was just this weird moment of like, oh, like, why did I write this poem? And maybe, you know, I think it was clever. I think it was like a good poem, but I don't think it was what, like, I'm probably not even going to put it like in a book. You know, it wasn't necessarily, you know, towards whatever greater writing project I'm working on.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting, you know, kind of realization of like, oh.
Yeah.
You know, same with like slam. Like, you know, slam, I think there's always been some poems that are like the crowd pleasers. And you complain like, oh, I have to do the crowd pleasing poem. But like, honestly, like I've done more and more readings where I kind of just do what I want. Where I'm just like, you know, you invited me to read here, and like, whatever you're, like, I still want it to be good, and I want you to be moved, but I don't want to have to rely on things that no longer move me. or stuff that is also like, I remember I had a poem like I used to do a lot about my mom, and I don't think I've done that poem once this year. I kind of like retired that poem. That poem was also supposed to be in the book, and kind of in the revision, it was a book that it was a poem that I took out. And I think there was like this moment of like, this poem served a very important purpose for me at one point, and now it doesn't serve that purpose anymore. And like my thoughts about everything have changed, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna, like this, letting poems live in that way, I think is really interesting. Or writing in general, writing doesn't just do the work of, oh, I wrote a poem and it got published, and now you read it and you think, because like, I think that we run into this problem. You've definitely run into this before, I'm sure, where you go to a poetry reading and you read something very personal, and someone tells you, wow, I really enjoyed your poetry reading. It was really beautiful. And I feel like that's a very weird response, because like very few poetry readings I go to, they're not always enjoyable, even if they're good. If they're, does that make sense?
No.
And like I feel like enjoyable might be the wrong context in which to think of poetry, or beautiful even. Like I think poems can be beautiful, but also like.
I think the word that always trips me out when people will say, "That was a very fine poem." It's very fine, like.
Which like I want to write well-crafted poems, but I also want it's a. I don't know. That's not my end-all be-all. The craft of the poem is just the vehicle for something else.
I think the word "fine" kind of just goes back to some sort of romantic era. It's sort of a poem's very delicate. It's a flower that's and I don't think we necessarily write that way. No, I totally hear you on that sort of crowd pleasing dynamic, and I've struggled with that too. I mean, I even when I did the Peace Center gig, I was, I knew I had about 20 minutes, and I was like, okay, what I got about time for maybe 4 or 5 poems. What am I gonna do? And for me, like, I definitely, for a lot of years when I was a teacher, I definitely crafted sort of like a spoken word persona of like the teacher poet, you know what I mean? It was sort of like in that kind of Taylor Mali tradition, right?
Yeah.
And I got a lot of mileage out of writing poems about my teaching life. And there's some of those poems that I still really love. And at the Peace Center, I actually did Sarah Wants to Ask Out a Girl. So I love that poem. It's still pretty meaningful to me. And I knew that there, as you know, because I think you've done some workshops with them, the Peace Center has that kind of youth poets program, and I knew a lot of those youth poets were going to be there that night, so I wanted to read something that I thought might kind of speak to them. But I'm not a teacher anymore, and so bringing up some of these old teacher poems feels a little funny to me now. And so it's that I don't know if other types of poets, and certainly I don't know how other types of writers relate to that, because being a spoken word poet is almost like kind of being like a musician, where you feel obligated to kind of play the greatest hits sometimes.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like if I'm just thinking about Marcus, like if you were Prince, like, can you do a concert and not play Purple Rain?
Right.
You know what I mean? Or are people going to be pissed when they leave? Like, I went to see Prince and like he didn't play Purple Rain.
Yeah. But
I'm sure Prince got sick of Purple Rain. I remember, when I was in high school, I was a big Nirvana fan. I remember reading an interview, with Kurt Cobain. By like 1992, like he refused to play Smells Like Teen Spirit. He got sick of it. And I don't know how other writers in different genres relate to this. Maybe if you like, or maybe it's like a novelist who feels always defined by their first book, or J.K. Rowling will always be defined by Harry Potter, and that's tough, and I think artistically we all
it's not that tough. She's a billionaire.
Well, it's real rough, for her. But no, I'm sure, but as an artist, I think every genre has its own versions of this, and I think within spoken word, it's, the poems that are more audience pleasers, and it can be scary to let those poems go.
I think the issue it depends on the spoken word poet, because I think really good spoken word poets and people who end up doing really well in slam, there's, I think, certain people who, and we've seen, I've made fun of these people before, but like they have the poem, you know, this like, oh, this is my signature poem.
Yeah.
And they do the same poems year after year after year. But like, there's some really cool poets I feel that like either evolve in different ways and like try out new things, or they just keep like writing new and new things. Like there's a poet I've been following recently named Anthony McPherson. Do you know him?
No.
He's pretty big in the slam world right now. And like I think I don't remember, but like he had a couple of like big hits on like Button and stuff. And I think what's really interesting about him is that watching his videos and stuff, you know, he doesn't go to a reading and do the greatest hits of like, oh hey, this is what got 100,000 views on Button Poetry. He does something better. He's like, I'm gonna top that each time, you know, and it's like, oh, that was better. Oh, that was better. That, you know, and continues to improve and get better and better and better. And I think that's a really cool way to like approach growth, of saying like, oh, like, yes, I can fall back on these things and I will be praised for it. But what happens if I push myself? You know, that's something like, you know, you were talking about Prince. You know, I think what's funny about Prince is Prince has so many hits that if you went to a concert with Prince and expected him to play, like, there's no time to play all of the famous songs, you know? It's like, oh wait, is he going to play 1999? Or is he going to play Raspberry Beret? Or is he going to play, the, you know, Red Corvette?
You know, I've always thought, you know, there's a dynamic in the stand-up comedy world that I think is really artistically healthy, where, you know, so, like, if a comedian knows they want to release, like, a 1-hour Netflix special, right? They develop their set, they go on the road, they perform that 1 hour over and over and over again until it's crafted, and then when it's really ready and perfect, they record the special, they release it, and then they basically never perform those jokes ever again.
Right.
It's almost the opposite of like a musician, you know what I mean? You put the album out and then you go tour on it. But comedians kind of do the opposite, and it's sort of, it's like they release something and they have to start from scratch. And I know that's probably terrifying. But yeah, there is something to that though, where you have to go back to basics. You can't rely, because look, I mean, if you were a big fan of a comedian, you see their Netflix special, and then you go to their show 3 months later and they're doing the same jokes, you're not laughing anymore because you know all the punchlines. Like that. So I've always felt that was an interesting and frightening way to structure your art.
I get really excited if I go to a reading, because like usually, especially these days, like if I go to a reading, I probably read their book, or I plan on it, or I know some of their most well-known work, and they'll read some of those, but also they'll be like, these are the new poems I'm reading, and that's always such a kind of an electric experience to say, ooh, like, what is the new stuff that you're putting out? What is the stuff that you wrote yesterday? I want to hear these. Or even rough drafts too. I think it's cool. I've been listening to like different poetry readings where poets will read their rough drafts, and I do that all the time. You know, I always read brand new stuff. You know, at least like some brand new poem at every reading I do. But I feel like some poets, they'll like only read from books that have been published, and it's like, oh, here's a poem from 5 years ago. And I mean, I'll probably change my tune about that in about 5 years. We'll see. But certainly, I feel like that ability to evolve is quite cool.
Yeah. Well, speaking of evolution and what's new, what's 2019 looking like? What do you want it to look like?
Yeah. So you know, this year I think that I really wanted to establish myself as someone who was a literary writer who could like exist in literary spaces. And in 2019, I'm very interested in bringing literary spaces into non-literary spaces, if that makes sense. Bringing poems into non-literary spaces. So basically, so one thing is like, I really want to try to get a book or a chapbook published, or get a publishing deal, which I know is a superficial goal, but I mean, it's, I want to get a book deal. That's a goal. But and then I also want to finish the novel that I'm working on. I remember we talked about, I think our very first episode, what we're going to do in 2018. I was like, finish the novel. That didn't happen. I completely changed the novel like 7 times. So I'm basically writing a brand new novel again. Such is life. So I'm working on it pretty hard. We'll see. I'm about 30,000 words in right now. So yeah, that would be cool. But also to do some weird stuff. So I have a couple of different like, I want to get back into actually, we talked about stepping away from spoken word, but I'm really interested in whether I can still survive as a spoken word poet. So I'm interested in taking the poems that I have now and performing them in spoken word spaces and thinking about ways to perform, especially since a lot of the big change in my poetry has been that a lot of my poems are a lot shorter. So, it takes like 45 seconds to a minute and a half at most to read, while like that's totally, in spoken word, it's like 3 minutes to 5 minutes is like a poem. But I'm interested in like either reconfiguring poems and not having them be so precious, of saying like, oh, how can I do a remix of poems that I've already published and put out, and perform them in a way. So like, for example, I just got invited to do this reading called Salmon and Grits, and Sleepy Eyes does it every year, and I've always wanted to be invited, and this year I got invited. I got the invite, guys. So I'm really excited, but also like, I probably would have fit into this lineup a lot better 2 years ago when I was doing more intentionally spoken word poetry. So I'm interested in how to do that. I'm going to be doing, so I mentioned doing another project with my publisher. In January and February, we're going to be recording an audiobook of my first novel, Heathens and Liars of Lickskillet County. So please buy my book on Audible. That'll come out hopefully by the end of 2019.
That's exciting.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to be going back on tour to do some bookstore readings from Heathens and Liars, which is going to be quite an experience. I've just reread the book. I have such mixed feelings about it, especially since like right now I'm writing a book about like the rural South again, so I feel like I'm in a way returning to Lickskillet in a way that's like feels very roundabout, where I'm like, I wanted to distance myself, and I'm
gonna do the Faulkner thing, just set it in a mythical southern town.
Yes,
all your novels.
Yeah, that's literally what I'm doing. So like I'm probably gonna like talk about Lickskillet in the new book and tie those together in some ways, which is quite cool.
That's awesome. I love that.
So it's just been a really interesting time to kind of revisit my prose, and like honestly, like I've been writing poetry recently, but also like I'm trying to like spend more of my energy and attention on prose. I mentioned doing stuff in weird spaces. I'm really interested in more like public arts projects. So I'm really inspired by, we had a conversation with Scott Cunningham of the O Miami Festival.
We'll hopefully get that episode out before too long. We want to talk with Marcus in combination with it. We'll get to it.
So I'm really interested in ways in which I can bring that, because like I live in a small town, and like it's not that small, but it's not Charleston either. It's definitely not Miami, and so I'm wondering ways in which I can basically use poetry to enter new places. So for example, this past year, one of my poems was on a bus in Columbia, South Carolina. That was a project that was initiated by Ed Madden, and then one of his students used, they did public poetry projects, and one of my poems was used in this project where they basically gave out poems in hospitals and put up poems of like, basically healing and reflection in different places in a hospital, so that people would have some place to kind of basically see poems in a place where they might not see poems, I guess. So that was really cool. I was like, oh wow, my poems are in hospitals, my poems are on buses, and I was like, where else can I put my poems? And I have a lot of ideas for that. One of the things also I'm doing, this is still a project in motion, so it might not work out, but I'm working with a local musician here in Charleston to put out an album. I don't think, if I told you about that yet?
No.
Oh yeah.
Breaking news.
Yeah, it's kind of a secret project, but I guess I finally recorded the poems yesterday, and he made a lot of music. So it's electronic music album to my poems, and it's not going to be like a long album, but basically it's like an exploration of alcoholism and addiction, and familial generational kind of cycles of that sort of thing.
Are you ready to announce the collaborator, the musician?
Oh
yeah. Is that still
no. He's you should check out his work on Bandcamp and SoundCloud. His name is Tim Woodbridge.
Don't even know.
I wish I could remember the name of his music project. So we're basically kind of playing around right now. But like, again, this is kind of where I've been inspired by Marcus, where it's just like, hey, there's this guy, let's play around and see how it sounds.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And he's really good. He heard me at, we did a show for Freeverse where it was like electronic music and poetry.
Oh, yeah,
and so he approached me after that and said, hey, I also make music.
Oh, okay, I think I know which guy you're talking about.
And wanted to talk to me about it. And so, yeah, I think it's just Tim Woodbridge on SoundCloud.
Yeah, I remember that guy. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Cool.
So he's pretty cool. I really like his music, so hopefully he'll be able to... It's more of him doing it, and then I'm just providing some vocals. And I told him to do whatever he wants, because I think it'll just be interesting. So my voice might end up getting a little weird.
So you recorded all your stuff first, then he's crafting music around it, or
yeah,
more
he
already
recorded
has
a
some
couple
stuff?
of songs first to show me, and then we kind of talked about the mood, and then so we basically did 2 of the poems. And then I really, really loved how it sounded. So then I just recorded 10 poems to then be like, okay, what can we do if we have... Because my poems, again, are very short. So, like, the whole album, I mean, it'll be like, you know, my version, I mean, it was like 20 minutes of recording altogether. Because each one is only like a minute or 2 long. Mm-hmm. But I think that we're going to stretch out. Like, there's going to be a lot more pauses. And I made it so that it's going to be weird, man.
Cool.
But in a good way.
Yeah.
In a way that I think will be quite enjoyable.
That's awesome, man. So you did a real laid back 2019, huh? Just
yeah,
not working
going
on
in.
much. Just
Yeah,
kinda being lazy?
right now, actually, this afternoon before we have an open mic, I need to go design some workshops because I'm doing a workshop series at the Peace Center in January.
That's awesome, man.
Trying to think what else I'm doing. I'm doing a bunch of other stuff. I just booked my first festival gig and hopefully going to be doing some more like panel stuff. So, especially stuff in South Carolina, but I'm going to try to go beyond as well. Especially if I have a book come out this year, we're going places, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, I think that's all. I'm not even sure. The audiobook I'm really excited about. Obviously, the poetry book is still in progress. A lot of poems that I wrote are coming out in the literary magazine, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I'll put those out as they come out.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Well, I guess let me think about my year. Well, I'm really excited about how Contribute Your Verse is growing. I mean, not so obviously the podcast, and we need to. We'll kind of talk a little bit about what the podcast will look like in the coming year as well. But there's so much other stuff going on. So I've been doing. So this past fall, I taught my first ever online course, which went really well the first round. I based it in large part upon the book The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And that was a pretty good system. Like, it was nice to have like a structure that I didn't have to totally reinvent the wheel, you know? Now I'm totally reinventing the wheel for this new version of it. So so it's gonna start in January. So yes, 12 weeks of conscious creativity. And my goal is to offer it, I think, at least 3 times during the year. So it'll go like January through March, take a month off, kind of go like May, June, July, take a month off, and then do like September, October, November again. So it's really fun for me. It reminds me of the parts of teaching that I really love, like designing curriculum, and I actually really like laughed to myself a few days ago where I'm using a lot of Google programs like Google Classroom, and which is exactly what I use as a teacher. You know, like my last 2 years at School of the Arts, I ran everything through Google Classroom.
I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, it's Google's education app, but you can use it for.
Is it free?
Yeah, it's totally free. So you can design a course. Literally, like an actual teacher at a school can use it. But if you're just a person and you're trying to do an online course, it's really handy. So we're going to do all of our, we're meeting once a week online through like a video conference. We're going to use Google Hangouts. They're going to be sending me writing through Google Docs. So it's just all Google. but literally that's exactly how I did it
cool.
as a high school teacher. So it's these weird flashbacks of all that. But and in general, like I'm really excited how my writing coaching work through Contribute Your Verse is really growing. And it actually reminds me of something, going back to many of the profound things that Jonathan said when we had him on. He said something about teaching that really stuck with me, where he said that he didn't really start becoming a really good teacher until he realized that he wasn't really teaching English, he was teaching people. You know what I mean? And I think I've kind of had to go through a similar process with writing coaching, where I'm realizing that when I got into this, I figured that I would be coaching how to write, or maybe how to be more successful as a writer. And I'm having the same epiphany that I'm coaching people. And we're using the lens of writing, like that's our method, that's our tool. Mm-hmm. But I'm really working with people, and I love that. Like that's what I find so exciting about this work, and how I want to keep growing in it. So I'm actually working with a life coach right now, kind of just working through some personal stuff, but who's also going to be mentoring me in some strategies for doing life coaching. Because what I keep running into with the clients I work with, whether it was the people who did the course or the people I work one-on-one with, when they're having struggles in their writing, it's usually not about like, oh, I'm really struggling with form, or like I'm really struggling, like, you know what I mean? They're struggling to write because they're tired from their job, or they got like relationship stuff going on, or just the dynamic in their house isn't that great, or money, or whatever. And in terms of really mentoring someone to be a more successful and like happy creative person, it's of course not just about the creativity, it's about all the other stuff. And so I'm actually trying to get some more training so that I know how to do that stuff responsibly. So if someone says, hey, I really want to focus on my writing and my job sucks, like, should I leave my job? I want to make sure that if we get into that issue, that like I can offer some advice that isn't just me talking out of my ass.
Quit your job,
right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that I could actually like, in a structured way, mentor them maybe through that process, or whatever choices they want to make. You know what I mean? If someone comes to me and says like, look, like the relationship I'm in is really tough on my creativity, my partner doesn't understand my desire to want to write, and they don't support me, I want to be able to help them through that in a way that, again, I'm not just talking bullshit, Mm-hmm. So I'm really trying to get some training in that arena for the more personal stuff. So, and kind of looking into like writing therapy and that sort of thing. And, because like I think so much of us come into our writing lives with kind of two purposes. Like we have sort of these literary ambitions, but we're always writing to figure ourselves out, and whether we want to think of writing as therapy, like we've talked on the podcast about how that's a little complicated sometimes, but we are writing to hopefully maybe feel better in some kind of way. And I want Contribute Your Verse to speak to both of those things, like how to have a career as a writer, but then also like how do you just have your life together as a creative, and like it's a more holistic vision for me of like how to do this coaching work. So that's really exciting to me. And like I said, I want to write more essays this year that speak more to that. And I'm also trying to get my poetry in some new spaces as well. I got some stuff actually kind of lined up. This is also my little secret project. In February and March, I'm actually going to be doing some poetry stuff at a meditation studio downtown. There's a place called Still Soul Studio. We're going to be doing a kind of a performance night where there's going to be, it was kind of the event I wanted to do for This One Breath that kind of fell apart, where there's going to be some music, there's going to be a meditation teacher, and I'm going to be doing poetry, and it's going to be this sort of interactive evening. But then I'm going to come back in March and actually do some writing workshops that's going to incorporate meditation a little bit too. So that's always been something I've been really interested in, because I meditate a lot and I do yoga, and I've always seen that like if I'm going to get into a writing, like a writing space, and I'm going to write for about an hour, like for me, like doing a short meditation, just like taking a few deep breaths to kind of clear the mind, is so enormously helpful for getting that creativity flowing. So to be able to like really train people to how to do that better, I think is just really exciting to me. So yeah, and then I'm going to be moving to Asheville and looking to connect with some of the people up there, and trying to just scope out in different like open mics. And so I got a lot to learn, and gonna have to make a lot of new contacts up there. That's the kind of scary part, of so much of my life, and even like this writing coaching stuff has been so centered on Charleston. So I'm gonna have my work cut out for me.
Yeah.
Building a network there.
I think people sometimes underestimate how much of someone's identity is tied to place.
Mm-hmm.
Not just of like, oh, I'm from here, which is an important aspect of someone's identity, but also that you're identified through your relationships. And so people know you as, okay, like, you can kind of, you've established a certain reputation as, oh, you're a writer, you're this writing coach,
mm-hmm.
you're this, you're that. But when you enter a new space, all of that is kind of wiped clean, which is awesome, because it's like, oh, you get to let go of all the bad things, but also terrifying, because that means like, oh, the first words out of your mouth, like, okay, now there's a new identity being built, basically, in someone else's mind, and you can't rely on old, things, I guess, to...
Yeah, it is equally liberating and terrifying. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're coming up on about 1:15. We were going to talk about our favorite books from the year. Do you want to just wrap this up, or do you want to end with 5 minutes of talking about books?
Let's talk about our books.
Okay, cool.
I read a lot of books this year.
Yeah.
I'll just say that. Like, I tried to read a bunch of poetry books. Why don't you talk first, and I'm going to look on my phone.
Cool, because we're at my house, so I had all of my favorite books very handy. So yeah, I just thought I would share, this would be a good way to end, because we're not just writers, we're also passionate readers. My favorite poetry book from the year, and I think I got almost all of these from Buxton Books, where I work. Mary Oliver, who I've just loved for years. I mean, she's obviously a very beloved poet, but this year came out with like her big selected poems. I mean, she's getting up there in years. We might not have Mary Oliver for too much longer. So it's really cool. I mean, this is pretty much the best of her life's work. And I was just joking earlier about, becoming more of like a nature-centered poet and writing more outdoors. And she's always been, I don't think Mary Oliver has a single poem that's set indoors. It's so I've definitely been taking a lot of inspiration from her and learning how to write about spirituality in a way that's very accessible to people. I've always found that really interesting. So yeah, if you are remotely a Mary Oliver fan, you should pick up this. Probably one of my favorite novels of the year. This is The Lost Queen by Signe Pike. And I've actually gotten to know Signe pretty well. She lives in Mount Pleasant, so she's local. And Buxton Books did a release party for this book. So it's historical fiction set in, I think it's 6th century Scotland. But it kind of goes into the legend of, or the history behind the legend of Merlin, and how some historians think Merlin actually had a twin sister who became like an early queen of Scotland. So it kind of goes into that history. It reads very much like a fantasy novel. So if you like fantasy, you'll see a lot of similarities. But Signe actually really did her research and took many trips to Scotland, and I just really thought it was awesome, and she's great. And then nonfiction-wise, How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan's book on psychedelics, was really, really cool. And it's been so funny how mainstream this book has gotten. Like, we have this in Buxton Books, and like I've had several conversations at the bookstore, like about psychedelics, and just the fact that that conversation is going somewhat more mainstream is just strange times we're living in, you know?
Yeah, I imagine in the next 10 years, our approach to using psychedelics and like MDMA and stuff like that as therapy is going to change pretty dramatically.
It's really interesting. I think Oregon might be getting kind of close to legalizing psilocybin, which would definitely make research a lot more interesting. There's some really fascinating stuff. I mean, I'm going to be forgetting a lot of the studies, the specifics of them, but I know Johns Hopkins has been doing a lot of interesting studies, both with psilocybin and MDMA, helping with everything from like PTSD to depression to assisting people who have terminal illnesses. Like, you know, there's people maybe that are right at the end of their life, maybe they're freaking out about death, and they have a psilocybin experience, and they're like, I'm not scared of death anymore. Some pretty and just to have, you know, an author like Michael Pollan who is brilliant. If you've never read like The Omnivore's Dilemma, it's a really awesome book. But just to have someone sort of mainstream like him tackling a subject that's been on like the fringes, you know, and I love those fringe people too. I mean, I'm a huge do you know who like Terrence McKenna is? Do you know him? Mm-hmm. I mean, I love that dude too, and his brother Dennis is really awesome, and they've been, you know, advocating the spiritual and therapeutic benefits of psychedelics for years. But I think there's a renewed interest here, and just to see it like if it could become more medically accepted and people could really go to like a safe place. And
I think it would be really interesting to see like microdosing as well become more mainstream.
Yeah,
I've heard a lot of things about that, which would be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, again, for people with, I think, again, PTSD and depression really seems to help. And also another just the effect like psilocybin can have on folks who have like other forms of addiction. Like it's really like alcoholism and nicotine addiction. Like people can really break free of some of those addictions by 2 or 3 psilocybin experiences. So it's funny, there's like a quote unquote a drug that helps you get unaddicted from other drugs, you know? And it's a plant. It's fascinating. So those are my at least 3 favorite books from this year. Yeah.
I read an insane amount of books this year. I think I read at least one novel and 1 poetry book every week of this year, which is a lot. I'm trying to think. So poetry, I'll put a list online of the books I like this year.
Yeah.
Just because like a lot of people I already like Sam Sachs and Hugh Min Nguyen, like came up with books that I was like, I already knew I was gonna like them. I love them. It was amazing. But other books I guess that I've read that really stuck with me was Jenny Shi. I think it was her debut poetry collection called Eye Level. Is really amazing and incredibly written. I just read a book. This book was published a long time ago, like 2004. But you know, like when you are looking at like certain authors, and you're like, oh, this is like I don't know. There's something about the author that you're like, there's this realization that like almost as if you're like the mentorship of a book is like, oh, this was the book. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Or even like I realize a lot of my favorite authors are then influenced by this other author, and it's almost like this timeline. So I read Richard Sykin, I think this is how you pronounce his name, Richard Sykin, and he wrote a book called Crush, and it is just so good. It's like one of those books of poetry where like sentence by sentence, line by line, I was just like, oh wow, God, this is so good.
And he sort of inspired some other people.
I feel, I feel like I see his influence in other writers, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of where this, like, you know, almost like the source of something.
Very cool.
So I've been people have been telling me to read that book for years, and I haven't, and then I finally just got it, and then I was like, oh my God, this book is so good. So that one, I'll release something online. Novels, I read a lot of books. I also did a lot of audiobooks. So the ones that I really, really loved, I read There by Tommy Orange.
I've heard awesome things about that.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest it. It's basically about like the urban experience of Native Americans in Oakland, which is something I never even thought about. So it was quite cool. Monsoon Mansion was by a local author, Morris Sanel Barnes, was really incredible. Sorry, I'm looking on my... I read actually another book by a local author, Grady Hendrix. He doesn't live here anymore, but he grew up, I think, in Mount Pleasant or James Island. And he wrote a couple books, one called Horror Store. You ever heard that one?
Yeah, we actually have that in Bucks and Books.
So I read I think it was his third book, called My Best Friend's Exorcism.
There's almost like a throwback. It's almost like a Stranger Things kind of feel.
But a lot darker. It's so good. It's so
cool.
funny. It's so good. I read The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay, which is about like the AIDS epidemic in Chicago. David Joy, have you ever read him? He's a Appalachian writer. So I've been trying to read more Southern writers. And that's kind of
very cool.
The ones that really blew me away this year. Probably some other ones that I read, but I don't remember them all. But good stuff. Hopefully, there's a new book by Kesey Lehman called Heavy that I hope to read before the end of the year.
We also have that in the book.
I haven't. I've heard it's so good.
Yeah.
But I haven't gotten to it yet. I have some other books I have to finish beforehand.
Yeah. My stack of books to read is pretty extensive at this point too.
Yeah.
So.
I've also read a bunch of nonfiction this year about opiate addictions because that's what my next novel is going to be about. So that's been a fun time. So I spent a lot of time reading books of essays about, but it's also really quite not just informational, but like some of the books are quite well done.
Yeah.
Which is cool. There's one called, I think it's Sam Quinones, and he wrote a book called Dreamland. That's probably the best book about the opiate epidemic. I would definitely suggest it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, let's close up by just telling the audience a little bit about just what the podcast would be like, because we were trying to get some things figured out, because obviously I'm going to be moving to Asheville, and so it's going to kind of create some changes. So I think what we're kind of thinking is that I'll probably kind of keep focused on some of the interview style, conversation style episodes, which has kind of been the bulk of what our episodes have been thus far. So I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on that. So you'll probably start seeing some more interviews from people in the North Carolina area as I kind of expand out. But you're going to maybe be focusing a bit more on a newer format of our episodes, and that might also branch off into maybe a new podcast. So just, what are you thinking about that?
We're gonna do some experimentation about the format. We're gonna be releasing a series of basically essaic. Is that how you say the word? Essaic episodes that are gonna be approaches to writing from unexpected places. So I'm gonna be talking about poetry and fiction writing, nonfiction writing, but basically thinking about them in ways that. I think that we can talk about in a more like everyday way instead of just being like do this, do that, of more exploring different themes through that essay format. You'll see what I mean when we do it. So like I have recorded one episode that I think does what I want to do, and it's basically talking about how Dungeons and Dragons and playing Dungeons and Dragons has taught me to be a better storyteller.
Nerd alert.
Some serious nerd alert. So that'll hopefully come out on this podcast pretty soon in 2019.
So we might be working a bit more independently, but still hopefully producing some pretty cool episodes here for you. And I want to try. I did one sort of essay style episode a month or two back, and I really enjoyed it. So I want to make some contributions to that too.
I think even if we split it up into two podcasts, we'll still be on each other's podcasts often enough. So you'll not miss us. No worries.
So there will be continued evolution and lots of good growth and all that kinds of good stuff. So anyway, thank you all for your support.
And we're going to make a Patreon. So if you like this podcast and you want us to continue, we'll have a Patreon very soon that you can contribute to and get some bonus material. It might be me reading poems. It might be access to that new album. It might be some bonus essays. Who knows?
T-shirts, mugs.
You know, it might be us just talking about books that we like for maybe an hour and a half. It could be a lot of cool things. Oh, I would love a T-shirt.
Yeah.
That'd be cool. I do T-shirts. Yeah.
Well, we wish you all an awesome 2019. So good luck with all your writing projects.
Keep it lit.
All right.